All right. Lauren Spangler, among other things, a painter, writer, musician, creative coach. Thank you for being here today and for your conversation. How are you, and what were your first memories of creativity?
Oh, man. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Glad to be here with you. Um, First memories of creativity. When I was little, my family was really creative, but like low grade creative. Like my mom was a mathematician, my dad was an engineer, but they were also, music lovers and art lovers. And my mom read to us all the time, and my dad would play piano. And so I was sort of always surrounded by creative moments. But my mom would sometimes make up these little songs to get us to do stuff. I don't know if you have kids, but sometimes you come up with little rhymes to make unfun things fun. She would do
Okay.
that, and that was actually truly create. She was really creating in the moment by the seat of her pants things to get my sister and I to wash our hands or cross the street or whatever it was. So that was pretty creative.
Okay.
First memories of me being creative would have been drawing or playing piano or writing stories. Yeah, I was always inside doing something creative instead of outside playing like most other kids were. So that was my happy place, inside with some pencils or at the piano.
Okay. Besides being a mom, then, which is probably the thing that takes up most of your time, what do you or what do you see yourself as if somebody said, what do you do for a living besides
Mm.
mom?
Yeah, I'm a creativity coach and also a strategist. So I work with folks who are um, looking to make progress with their creative goals and projects and maybe don't know where they're stuck or need a little bit of help figuring out how to take the next step and bridge the gap between what they know they want to make and how they're able to do it on a daily basis. So, in a creativity coaching sense, that's what I do. As a strategist, I consult for folks who are really wanting to get down to the nuts and bolts of how to make small and large steps in the near and long term to meet their goals, whatever they be. So, my favorite people to work with are folks like painters and musicians and authors who are established in their skill set, but still establishing their career. So, still building the masterpiece, writing the novel, painting the collection, and need a little bit of help taking it from being an aspirational hobby into something that they're doing and realizing in big ways each and every day. So, yeah, in a nutshell, creativity coach.
What's your pathway to that? Was that from being a painter and writer, musician yourself and seeing the need, or is there some other type of schooling you go to for that?
Yeah. Yeah, there yes to both. There are lots of coaching schools out there. There are creativity coaching schools out there. I reached it in sort of an interesting roundabout way. My training is actually in music, so you know, when we're 18 and they say, "What do you want to do with your life, and how are you going to support yourself?" And I thought music was the answer to both of those questions. Turned out it was the answer to the first question, didn't quite answer the second question of
Mm,
how to really support myself. And so I went through school. I was classically trained in performance and music theory and music composition, and got out of school and jumped into the world of being a full time performer. And I found after about a year that, um, gosh, getting good grades in music school is very different from actually being a successful performing artist. And so the School of Hard Knocks was my second training, and maybe even more valuable in some ways. So for me, after about a year of being a professional musician, I kind of hit this fork in the road where I realized that um, I was going to want a certain level of stability in my life and just financial freedom in my life that music was not providing for me at that time. It was also it was 2013. 2014 was the all-time low for the music economy. So it was a rough time to be in music, especially as a beginning artist. So in 2014, I actually decided to stop completely, and I built a totally different career as a strategist in a totally different field, and really just focused on the financial stability piece. Um, I knew that I wanted to be a mom. I knew that I wanted to be able to create the type of lifestyle that I had had as a kid. Having my mom tucking me in at night and reading me a bedtime story was really important. And at some point, I realized I wouldn't be doing that with my kids if I was, on a stage somewhere or doing an open mic night or on a tour or whatever. So at that moment, I sort of pivoted completely and just went down the financial stability path and rebuilt my career. Went through grad school for writing and strategy, and about 7 years down that road, I realized that the desire to be creative and the desire to make music and make art had not really gone away. And that I wasn't really satisfied with just, drawing in the spare moments or writing a song here and there. There was still this desire to make things that were meaningful to me and share them in meaningful ways. And so then I was at this impasse, like, how do I support my family? At that point, I was married, I had children, I had a mortgage, and I had a certain level of financial stability that I really wasn't willing to compromise. But I also had this desire to be creative and to spend a good portion of my energy and my time creating the things that were important to me. Um, so there was some deep work around how to reconcile these two pieces of my life and myself that were really important. And a lot of the messages we receive about what it means to be creative or what it means to be an artist um, don't leave a lot of room for both of those things. It's like there's the struggling artist archetype, which didn't appeal to me. There's the hobbyist who gave up their career to have a family, which didn't appeal to me. And I thought there was room for a middle ground where I could be both financially stable and creatively thriving and free. And so I spent a few years really digging deep and figuring out what that looked like for me and for my family. And in the process of figuring that out for myself, I wound up kind of learning the hard way some things that have been useful to other people and putting together some frameworks that others have been able to use to do that same thing and reintegrate creativity in a really meaningful, impactful way alongside the rest of their life without having to sacrifice either one. So that led me into creativity coaching. And as I started sharing that with other people and seeing them enjoy the same fulfillment that I had found, it was just super rewarding. So that's what I spend most of my days doing now.
Do you have a particular creative type that you have more as clients? Is it more painters or more musicians or?
I work with a lot of painters, mostly because I hang out on Instagram, and Instagram is just crawling with visual artists. It's just such a great platform for people to share their work. But I've worked with authors. I actually worked with a jeweler, a metal worker who was just tremendously talented in making jewelry, and she was struggling to create a new collection right after having a baby and returning from maternity leave. And so anyway, she was a blast to work with. But I'd say most are visual artists, painters, and illustrators have been the bulk of my clients, and a few musicians as well.
When with your painting, what's your medium of choice for that?
Right now, I'm into watercolor.
Okay.
Love it. I love mixing watercolor and colored pencil. I'm looking over here because I have my mess of art supplies. Like it's going to remind me, like, what mediums do I work in? Um, yeah, watercolor right now. I've enjoyed acrylics before, but watercolor is really therapeutic for me because you can't really control it very well. I mean, you can, and that's part of the discipline of it. But especially at first, watercolor is really unpredictable. It sort of flows where it wants to, and you can't control exactly how it's going to turn out, which for me, as a little bit of a type A person, was really interesting. I sort of fell in love with that because it helped me lean into the unpredictability of the creative process. So, yeah, right now I'd say that's my favorite.
What do you see the creative connections between painting and music then, especially piano?
Oh, yeah. Um, do you mean for me personally or just sort of in general? Me
For
personally?
you?
Well, this might be a long answer. Um, I started out making music, making songs, and um, actually, I started out avoiding my piano lesson practice. I was supposed to be practicing a certain set of stuff, and I never did. I would always prefer to just mess around and make up and improvise music. And so, as a kid, I was always making music, um, and I was also drawing, but drawing was more like a just for fun thing, and music I took a lot more seriously. And I would say, in terms of creative expression and creative process, for me, music was more um, immediate and more like when you're improvising music, it's a really kind of like thought, feeling, flow out. Like there's not a lot of time to overthink when you're improvising versus when I was drawing or sketching, there was a lot of time to really labor over every detail. So when I was little, um, I would say music was a little bit more raw expression. Actually, my mom said that when I would come home from school as a kid, she could tell if I'd had a good day or a bad day based on how the music sounded coming out of the piano when I was playing. So there was something really immediate for me there with music. And then as I studied music and got deeper into the actual, um, the deep practice, the lessons and the performances and the juries and the judged competitions and things in music, it started to carry a lot of weight. And I think I lost a lot of that raw expression in music. Um, and so by the time I got through college and graduated and was performing, at that point, when I would sit down to play, I was so wrapped around the rightness or wrongness of what I was playing and how, or in a performance, like, did I miss any notes? And, it all became really technical. And I lost a lot of that um, sort of like mindful in the moment experiencing the creation of it piece. And so if I look back actually at the moment I left music, first a long time ago, I realized that I had actually hit creative burnout and I didn't realize it at the time. And I actually spent about 7 years in burnout. And then drawing and painting is what actually pulled me out of it because 7 years later, I found myself drawing and painting, and all these things were coming back up. And I didn't have the same rigor in my mind around how to paint, how to draw. I wasn't formally trained. I didn't have a teacher grading my work. There was nothing, the bar was super low. It was just for fun. And I think that allowed me to reconnect to just falling in love with the experience of imagining something and making it and following the process as it unfolded. And I found that as I began to get back into music and pick it all back up, um, the cross disciplineness of being a painter and also being a musician sort of unlocked both a little bit for me. Um, so when I did get back in front of the piano and start writing again and start singing again, um, I felt myself tapping into some of the mindfulness and some of the playfulness and curiosity that I had allowed to come in during the painting and during the drawing. Um, and so now I would say they're different tools based on what I'm trying to express or what I'm trying to create or what I'm trying to do for a viewer or a listener. I'll pick different mediums based on what I'm trying to communicate. Um, but they definitely feed each other, and I would say they're part of, like, my creative diet, for lack of a better term. It's like they're diversifying the ways that for me personally, my creative soul kind of is fed and nourished. Does that make sense?
It does. Where do you think, or where do you picture creativity residing, whether it's in your mind or outside of you? Do you How do you see like if you're thinking about creative things
Yeah.
and then you're not thinking about them, what's creativity doing while you're not thinking about them?
Oh, that's a juicy question. Um, I don't know that I've ever thought about that before. For me, creativity is less of a thing and more of a state. Um, it's not, I would say that it's more of a, let me think about that. So, like if you're eating chocolate, you're like eating it or not eating it. And when you're not eating it, it's in the pantry waiting to be eaten, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know that I feel that way about creativity. I feel like creativity is more like taking a walk. Like when you're taking a walk, you're walking. And when you're not taking a walk, the path is still outside. Like there's still the sidewalk you might choose to go onto, but there's not a walk happening without you that you're not plugging into. Does that make sense? In my mind.
Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
well, you talked earlier about when you're getting into the flow of things.
Yeah.
So music, it feels different than painting. And
Yeah.
I wonder how those are connected, but also are they just different kind of creative muses, I guess, to
Oh,
explain it that
yeah.
way. Of it's its own little thing, like the music muse, the
Oh,
painting
that's
muse,
interesting.
the writing muse.
I would say it's the same thing for me. I would say it's the same. Probably it feels the same because it involves a lot of the same discipline. So a lot of the same, um, the way I walk myself through, like I'm going to carve out some time to go be creative. And I know that during that time, I'm going to be open to exploring what comes up and I'm going to play with an idea and I'm going to see where it goes and I'm going to work it and I'm going to develop it and then I'm going to listen, I'll follow the same kind of mental emotional path whether or not I'm at a piano or whether I'm in my studio painting or whatever. It's like it's sort of a similar um, cognitive and emotional process to go through, like ideation to creation to revision to sharing. Those phases look similar, whether it's music or art or writing. But I would say the way I decide which one to do or like what I choose to dip into on a given day is sort of what's on my mind. What idea do I really want to play with? Is there a song that's half written that I really want to go finish? Or is there an illustration that I've been wanting to try or some little piece of inspiration that popped up that I think is maybe a good poem and I want to go try to write it. So um yeah, I would say there are definitely parallels between all of them. For me, it's an act, it's a practice more than it's an entity.
What do you think an idea is then? If it's, where do you
Hmm.
think an idea begins? Is it something that we manifest ourselves through our own experience and ideas just in our whatever's going on in our brains? Or is it like the Romans thought of it, where genius is something outside of the self, where
Yeah.
if you looked at something and someone said, well, that's genius, that means it's something working through you. It's not
Mhm.
you making it, it's something else. I don't
Right,
think
like
that modern day looks at genius the same way, but
yeah, no, I don't think it's all just in there. I don't think it's completely, like a switch you turn on within yourself or turn off, and it's I would say, yeah, like inspire comes from the Latin inspirare, which means to breathe into, right? Or to be breathed into. And so there's definitely this concept that I resonate with, that there's like something larger that is flowing through you, that is being breathed into you, whatever. And people might call that muse or genius or God or spirit or universe or whatever. And so I think however you name it or whatever you call it, I think there's definitely this feeling for me while I'm creating that there's an external um, flow of energy or thought or idea or whatever, almost like and I think actually Elizabeth Gilbert has a beautiful quote about this that I really wish I had committed to memory because I won't be able to get her words right here. But she talks about the thought of an idea or an inspiration being this thing that you catch, that it like alights upon you like a bird, and it's up to you to kind of use it, or it'll fly away and find someone else. And
Mm.
I don't know if I necessarily want to believe that, because there are moments where I have a song idea and I can't act on it for days, and it would just give me terrible anxiety to think that the song might go find someone else. But there is this sensation when I'm making something where I feel like a paleontologist sometimes, like I'm brushing off the dust from this something, and I'm like discovering what it is as I'm going. And at some point, there is a sense that I'm discovering this other thing, and there are pieces where I feel like I'm building it together, and I'm joining the pieces together, and I'm constructing it. But at the same time, there's this feeling that I'm uncovering it as I go, and that it's already a thing that I'm stumbling upon. But it's hard to put into words, and it's also different for each project. There are times where I feel like I'm just like slaving over every word, like just sweating it out to get every line of a song. And it'll take me the months. I mean, there's a song I've been working on for a decade, and I just can't find that second verse. And I'm like working, but it's just not there yet. And then there are other times, one of my favorite pieces I've ever written, I wrote in one evening, and it was just there. It just kind of came out. And so it really varies. The experience varies a lot, piece to piece
Yeah.
and project to project.
Yeah, I find I can tell the difference between a poem that I decide to write and a poem that is presented to me somehow. Like the idea occurs, however ideas
Mhm,
occur. And
mhm.
I do see a difference between poetry and song lyrics,
Oh,
because you
yeah,
can write something and then say, well, this is obviously a poem versus this is a verse or a part of a
very
song.
much so.
When you put a song together, how do you think about the words and then the music, or like the words and then the sound, or is that happening at the same time, or is it different at different times?
The best ones happen together.
Mm.
The ones that feel the most natural, the ones that stick with me are usually come out together. Um, I'm usually a music first person, but probably that's process based, because I sit down and I improvise and I make up stuff, and then I'll catch on a melody and go, "Oh, that's really cool." Um, but the best lyrics I write come from an idea that often comes first. So I'll have a concept hit me that I go, "Oh, I really want to write a song about that. That's something I really want to communicate." And then sometimes I'll have just a conceptual framework, like here's kind of the path I want the message to go, or here's how I want here's the feeling I want to evoke throughout, and I'll kind of think about that first. But usually I'm also writing my lyrics while I'm at the piano. It's really hard for me to write lyrics when I'm not in a music making place. I can't write lyrics like I write poetry, which is
Mm.
just in like a separate space. So, um, yeah, I would say that for me, I really love when lyrics fit the shape of the melody so intimately that the melody almost feels like the way the timbre in your voice would change as you're speaking a sentence, and you hear that shape in the music. And so, um, yeah, the things I like the most that I've made have usually happened in parallel.
There's some things I've been thinking about lately as far as what's the difference between words and music. And I think I'm leaning towards the idea that there isn't much of a difference, because it's all, if you read a word, it's different than saying it. So I think
Mhm.
that's the big difference, is the saying it is the music for the word. So
Mm. Mhm.
I like the way that that's developing. It's still something I'm thinking a lot about, but it's
I like that.
also trying to understand the difference of that place you are when you write poetry versus the place you are when you write music. I think it is different, and I agree with your process of the music coming first to the lyrics, because I think
Mhm.
that's setting the mood. And I wonder how much that goes into the importance of sound. And it seems like vibrations or sound, same thing,
Yeah.
occurs a lot in different, whether it's religion or in different types of meditation or whatever, science and other things, where you can see the difference between megahertz affecting something on the same wave versus not. And that
Mm-hmm.
has to be why we're attracted to music and sound. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just still, I think a lot about how that affects what we think and what messages either we receive from wherever ideas come
Mm-hmm.
from again, or from how that recipe in our own experiences coalesces into something. So,
Yeah. Yeah. You had asked earlier where creativity lives, which was a really interesting question. And then when you were talking about vibration and the experience of sound and how a word is different when you speak it than when you read it, that makes me think about the experience of creativity as an embodied one, um, as a as a feeling experience where you are actually physically experiencing the sound and the vibration and the shape of the sound as you're creating it, and how different that is from a really cerebral, um, sort of more mathematical experience of like word piecing, like you might in poetry. Um, just super, super interesting. And I think for me, my my process with songwriting really shifted when I got in my body and out of my head. And when I was younger, I would just be all in my head, like completely in my head, to the point where I would just be in agony. I would have like my shoulder would be aching and my fingers, my wrists would hurt, like everything would hurt because I'd be like hours into making music and I would just be ignoring it because I didn't get the song, just right. And I was like mentally still really stimulated by the process of piecing this song together. And I was just totally, completely ignoring the physical experience entirely. And I actually had a piano teacher who um, had this just totally rewired my brain on how music could be experientially while making it. And I remember this was, a collegiate level instructor, and we sat down, and for our first few lessons, he had me play one note, just play a note and listen to the vibration of the piano string until it stopped vibrating, and feel what it felt like for the key and the piano to feel the resonance through my fingertip as I held that key down, and just let it go. And then push another key. And like you can imagine, I was really impatient at the beginning. I was like,
yeah,
come on, I can
this
play
is
more
some
than
bull.
one note. What are
Yeah,
we doing here? We
yeah.
got down to the end of the lesson. I'm like, we played 10 notes today. But eventually, once I actually knew how to listen to a note I played, then we played two notes at a time, right? And eventually we're playing chords. And by the time I was playing a piece of music, the experience that I had in relation to the piano, in relation to the sound waves, was totally different. And then the relation I had to the music I was beginning, to sing as I was songwriting, like it just totally transformed the way I was perceiving the music I was creating. And when it brought it into this really physical, embodied experience, for me, it became about 1,000 times more fulfilling and interesting.
I like the where practical application mixes together of things where you're learning how to play the piano and you're trying to connect with it. And you're also in another part of life trying to math and how to find X, Y axes and graphing things. And then when you put it into the more three-dimensional and you think about sound waves and how they travel and middle C and how you would chart that
Mhm.
on the XY, and then turn that sideways in your mind. There's programs you can do it on now, but to turn that sideways and see how it's shaped versus just that one-dimensional sound wave, that there's actually,
Mhm.
it's more of a spiral to it. And then connecting that with things that spiral like that, whether it's how a leaf falls or
Mm.
an insect flies or a bird flies, and then how the planet spins and how it spins around the sun and how that all spins around everything else and how that's also moving. And you start to see the connections of things, or I begin to understand that there's connections to things and I'm trying to find what they are. So
Mhm.
I think now when I was doing piano younger and I hadn't stuck with it as much as I should have. So 3 years of that, however many years ago. And I wonder, how can you get somebody to be interested in that, to see those things when they're younger, when they have
Mm.
maybe not been, when the creativity hasn't been crushed out of you as much as it has when you're an adult and you've been taught to stand in line and wait for these things and do all these things that you need to live in society, versus these things that you can be open to in creativity, whether it's just that one note and then thinking, what does that sound like over there?
Mhm.
What does that blade of grass sound like? Or what does the blade of grass hear or feel through the environment? And one day more than was policing and using forks to tune radar, and just having the two different tuning forks and that, and thinking, what else does everything must have its own little sound that it makes when it's hit or whatever. So
Mhm. Yeah.
I wonder how we can get younger people to see those connections or want to follow those
Mhm.
connections, rather than just get on with living whatever we need to in life. Is how can we keep that creativity?
Kids are so natural at play. I mean, really, it's play. That's really what it is. It's being curious and being open and being playful. And here's a quote I do remember actually. Austin Kleon has a fantastic quote that artists are professional noticers,
Mm,
and that art is really just turning your audience's attention towards something you think is worth their time, right?
mm.
And I think that's so true. I think it's beautiful, and I think it's totally the antidote to creative block, by the way, or writer's block. It's like, what are you noticing? What do you think you want other people to notice? And kids notice the heck out of everything around them, and so all you have to do is nudge them in that direction and put it on their radar, and they're natural pattern makers, they're natural noticers, they love to play. Um, yeah, it would be really interesting to take um, the nuances you were just describing and throw them at a 6-year-old, at a 7, 8, 6, 7, 8-year-old, and just to connect some of those dots and see where they would go with it. I bet they'd run with it naturally.
Yeah, like graph that whatever chord, like use math and
Yeah.
put that on a grid to see what that looks like, and then
It's
hear it.
interesting because in music theory, we do nothing but graph chords, right? I spent years like graphing chords and the math behind the music. That's theory is really an interesting way to look under the hood of music. And I loved that. It made me a better musician. It certainly made me a better composer. But it made me a terrible performer. It really took me
Huh.
into just this really heady, super cerebral analytical place where um, I started making music for a while that thought well, like it was mathematically stimulating, which for another
Yeah.
theorist was probably fun, but for anyone listening to it who didn't know what those chords looked like and what that chart looked like and like didn't find that interesting, um, like it didn't sound great. And so I think there's a happy medium between understanding the underlying structures and the mathematics that underpin it, and then also coming back to the basic ground truth of like, is anyone tapping their toes? Like, do you like how this are you enjoying how this music feels for you? Like, does it bring a good feeling? Both of those things have to be attended to, I think, for music to be, in my book at least, for music to be successful.
I didn't know that you graphed chords in music school. That's
It's super fun.
interesting. It would have made the math more interesting and the music more interesting, I think. But
100%. Oh, yeah, that was my major. I loved it. It was very nerdy and very fun.
it seems like that would lend itself to painting as well, because then you can
Yeah.
paint the concept of it, and you have a spiral going through something, and someone recognizes that as whatever the chord is. That
Yeah, that's
interesting.
cool. That's a cool idea. I've experimented with painting, like, trying to blend music and painting together with video. So, like, having a song and then painting some sort of really abstract impressionist type of artwork that, was mimicking the sound in the song. It's been really fun. I've never actually finalized I haven't landed on anything that felt shareable yet, but it's been a really fun experiment.
They have those, eh, like a speaker. You put a speaker on there and you put something over it, and then I think I've seen it
Yeah.
done in water and in sand, and it makes
Mhm.
the whatever
That's
125
super cool.
megahertz, and it makes a shape,
Yeah, and
and
I've
then
seen
you
someone
can.
do it with liquid ink before too, where it
Mm.
created these really cool colored bubbles. Yeah, people have done some really cool things combining sound and visuals, like
Then you
sound
find that,
waves and art.
yeah, out in the real world, like some temples are built like that, like a
Yeah,
certain frequency, and you look at it and go, well, this is not a perfect circle here, and why is that? And then you find out, oh, if you do this, play this frequency over this plate of sand, you get this shape exactly how the
it's
overhead
cool.
view of the temple looks. And you go, okay, somebody's figured this out already.
That is so neat. Yeah, I love that.
It
Um,
makes me think about how the different, you go to the different edges of things, the spectrums, I guess, the world's a
mhm.
spectrum. And you have like Close Encounters when they're playing the music for the alien ship, and it starts off and you can follow it along, and you're like, oh, okay, it's this sound and this color, this sound and this color. And then towards the end, it's just so fast you can't understand it. Now, maybe the alien in that could understand it because it's based on some
Right.
mathematical procession
Yeah,
that you could call a
some
chord
formula.
theory. Yeah. But
Yeah,
it's the two different extremes of just the one note versus the many notes, either at the same
totally.
time or close together.
Yeah,
But
and the complexity can be really interesting and really exciting, but at some point, the complexity and that's just a matter of taste, I guess, right? Taste and exposure and, how much complexity is interesting to you before you max out and, like, can't make sense of the
mm,
colors and the lights anymore. We
mhm.
probably all have our own little sweet spots.
Yeah, what's palatable for the
Right,
average person.
exactly.
So the idea of focusing in on something, that makes me think more about the visual arts and painting or photography, where you can be somewhere and see a big landscape, but then you can focus in on one little part of it,
Mhm.
whether it's painting it or taking a picture of it. And you wouldn't normally think about that because it's just part of this information overload, that part of the spectrum that, because we are not so noticeable of everything, we're just looking at everything at once, getting that happy medium of what's palatable for the average person, versus
Mhm.
let's focus in on this little square inch of whatever this bigger picture is. And how how did you get into painting and decide what to paint? Is that part of it, of trying to focus in on a certain thing, or are you
Yeah.
doing landscapes, or what's your basic painting most of the time?
I wanted to paint and couldn't decide what to paint for about 12 years. Before I decided to stop worrying about what I was gonna paint and just go
Mm,
paint something. Um, I right now I paint a couple different things. I paint a lot of botanicals right now at this moment, like flowers and plants, and a lot of that started because I was just practicing mark making and experimenting, like, how can I control this brush? How does this paint work? How does this, pencil overlay with that hue, and how does this look? And, plants and flowers are a really easy way to do that because they're just so, um for me, it's you can go in a lot of different directions, and it's an easy subject to work with, so as, I'm not as focused on, like, how can I represent this flower perfectly, and if I can just let that go, and I'm like, "Okay, I'm painting, like, some lavender flower, like, this is no big it's just, like, some purple on some green, it's fine, it's no big deal." It frees me up to play with the medium and play with the technique, um, but when I am worried about making something that I'm intentionally really, really wanting to get right, I paint a lot of animals. I do illustrations of mama and baby animals. I got on a kick with that a few years ago when I was actually on maternity leave with my second child. And I think I'm just enchanted by animal illustrations for some reason. I don't know if it's all the picture books I read growing up, or if it's just a fun thing to draw and paint. But um, sometimes when I'm painting those really specific scenes, what I'm trying to capture is a moment I've experienced with my kids that I want to immemorialize a little bit for myself and remember. And so I sort of like imbue that moment and that feeling into this painting. And then um, it's actually worked pretty well because there are paintings I'll look back at that I painted when my son was tiny. Um, and I will actually remember the feeling of, like, what our life was like then and what it felt like to hold him right then, and I'll see this painting of, like, a mother panda holding her tiny little baby panda, and I'm like, "Yeah, that's because he was this big, and that's how it felt," and so, for me, those paintings are deeply personal because it's just like this little snapshot in my moments with my kids that I just wanna remember. Um, yeah, so then and it's actually hard for me to finish paintings that aren't motivated like that. Like I did a pretty big collection. I painted about 50 mama and baby animal paintings. And then I wanted to extend the collection with some other stuff, but I wasn't like it wasn't motivated by a moment with my kids that I like wanted to capture. And they turned out terribly. Like they just didn't, I think my heart wasn't in it. I wasn't as interested in them. It was more mechanical. And so I wound up not finishing those or sharing them with anybody just because they didn't have the same vibe.
I would argue that's the difference between you trying to do it and you connecting to something to do it. Like that, whatever
The
that is.
purpose there.
That's
Yeah.
not to diminish the self, but just
Sure.
to
The inspiration,
understand that
right?
there is something. Yeah, there's something out there. It's kind of like Forrest Gump when he got finished running, and that was just it. He was tired of
Yeah.
running. He's going to go home. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there are times I'll be frustrated. It has happened a couple times. There's that one song I referenced that's taken me, like, ages to finish, and my husband keeps saying, like, "It's done, call it done, there doesn't need to be a verse 2, like, just record it and get it out there," you know? He really likes the song as it is, and I'm telling him, like, "Nope, there's a verse 2." I think why I'm so frustrated is because the first verse and the chorus, I felt so inspired, and they just happened, and it was really easeful in their creation. And then
Mm.
it feels like that purpose, that inspiration, that motivation, that source, just kinda, like, left mid-project. It's like I showed up and my work partner, like, didn't clock in for the day, and I'm like, "Hey, we're not done with this project yet," but, like, dang, I can't for some reason, just can't hit that same level, that same caliber that the first verse feels like it has. So, yeah, it's satisfying when that inspiration feeling is there for the whole project, and every once in a while it leaves halfway through the project, and that's probably the hardest thing for me as an artist.
I wonder if that's because you changed or it changed. Like if you're thinking about the creativity and it's something you're following, that
Mhm.
that's why I have the idea of where does that creativity stay? How can you
Yeah.
go seek out that creativity to where you have a thing you're working on and then you want to go this way with it, but it went that way. And that's why it doesn't feel like it goes together because these other
Yeah.
things are separate from it. And then I wonder how much of that is just life saying you're not ready for that part yet, that you're going to get
Yeah.
back to it one day. Like it's in your mind to finish. It's in your mind
Mhm.
that there's more to it. But you hear a lot of, I hear it mostly from writers where they say, I'm not good enough to write this yet. I tried,
Mm.
I started
Yep.
writing it, and then I put it aside. And I have my own stuff like that where I'll go back and then get back into writing it, where it's a book that's almost done, but it's just missing
Mhm.
something. And I'm not sure how much of it it's missing, but I just know it's missing something. And then I try to write it, and you get a little bit sometimes, and you go, okay, that goes with it. But then you lose the track of it, or it's it goes a place you can't because you're just not ready to yet.
Yep.
And then some months or years down the road, something happens, or you think about something, or just the experience of life piled up enough to where then that enters your mind again. And then you're like, okay, you can continue on a little bit farther. It may be to finish it, or it may just be a little bit farther.
Yeah.
And that's why, for me, I think I was worried about poetry when I started doing that more a few years ago. And my goal was to write 3 poems a month for a year. And
Mhm.
then I extended that to 10. And I was like, that seems outlandish. That's too many to do in a month. But you just open yourself up to it, and you show up to do it, and you pay attention. So when
Yeah.
those thoughts come through your mind, or you get those little phrases, you write them down, because that's the difference between a writer and not, is a writer writes. So you write that down, and you end up with the note feature in your phone having 20 or 30 pages of notes. And now you got a mountain of things you have to figure out how to organize. And sometimes you get the whole poem at once, and then other times you get a few lines of it, or maybe just a line. And then eventually, through whatever method you've used to organize things, or whatever method you are open to, that they assemble themselves, it seems. And you go, of course
Yeah.
that goes there. Of course that goes there. And I've been, even when I started writing back in high school or middle school, writing poetry, I would write the date and the time down. And now I can go back, kind of like your paintings of the babies and their moms, where you can remember what was going on in your life at that
Mm.
moment. It's not just because of the date and time with it. I'm sure that helps a little, but it's more of, you can see if you were putting these together. And most of my poetry books are linear. So it starts from here to here, and it's maybe a year. One book covers 20 years, but it's, I worried that I wouldn't be able to tap into or to visit that place where that poetry comes from for me. And then I figured out that it's always there, that you just
Mhm.
have to figure out how you get to it. And that's different for different people, because maybe it's a different place for different people, or maybe it's the same place for everyone. I'm not sure. But
Mhm.
I feel the same way about music and writing, but it's from a different place for me. And maybe it's connected somehow. But
Mhm.
I can, if I wanted to think about poetry, I could think about poetry and then end up doing something. It might be something that nobody else likes or understands, but if I like it and
It's a different
understand
thing
it, that's good.
entirely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Yeah, I write all my best poetry in the middle of the night by accident.
hmm,
I don't know what it is about, like, if I have a practice daily where I carve out time to be creative, and I usually make piano or make music or paint. If I use that time and I sit down and say, "Great, I'm gonna write a poem," it's not
yeah.
gonna happen. I can't I can't schedule that one. I can't drop into it usually. Um, but my favorite poems that I've written have been in the dead middle of the night when the house is super quiet and I can't sleep and everyone else is sleeping and there's nothing else for me to do. And every once in a while, I'll get this little spark of an idea and I'll play with it. And yeah, it's weird. It is a different process than the others for me. Um, I don't know if I could put my finger on why, but it is.
Here's my two ways I visualize poetry more than anything. And that is, it's in this place that's between worlds, and we can go a certain distance into it, and it can go a certain distance into this middle zone that I picture as a dark forest. Not a dark forest like scary, but a dark forest that's just, it's twilight or darker. You can still see, but whatever. So you're visually, I can go to that place, and that's where I connect with whatever that poetry muse is. Like I can write a poem on my own without doing that, but I can tell I wrote that poem, and I wasn't the antenna or the whatever
The
the median
channel.
is for something else that's doing it.
Mhm.
So I picture it as that dark forest. So that's my visual. And you can go halfway in, and it can go halfway in, but you can't cross over to each other's side. And it makes me wonder, whatever I'm feeling that is, are they feeling the same thing from our side versus its side? So
That's a cool
that's
visual. I like
that's
that. I
interesting.
like that metaphor.
And the other is the classic river, where you put your bucket in or whatever and you draw something out, and then you see what you have. And that to me is more daytime. It's the lights are on. It's not
Mhm.
there's not as it's not as much mystery to it.
Mhm.
It's still a beautiful place, but that's where maybe that's more for prose writing than anything else. But there's some poetry in there too, where I really like that saying, and it's attributed to so many different places, where the same person can't step into the same river twice because they're not the same person and it's not the same river. And I think
That's
that
cool.
also connects to me with the idea of you're working on something that you can't finish because you just haven't gotten to the point where you can finish it.
Yep.
So you have to realize that, not force it, set it aside and do something else. But those are the two things in poetry, it's the main way. In
I
writing,
like that.
I have times often where you get into that flow of writing and you're writing a story or whatever, and you're like, wow, it's writing itself. This is not where I thought this was going to go. Whether it's between two characters or just the story in exposition. And those are the exciting times of writing, where then when you're done
What
with
a
it, it's
good
kind of like
feeling.
that, the highway hypnosis where you start driving
Yeah.
somewhere and then
Right, how did I
next thing
get
you know, you're
here?
there. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
that's a good feeling. You can't judge your session by whether or not you felt that though, I've found, for me
mm,
at least. Because I feel like when I have used that as a yardstick for whether or not it was a worthwhile, creative practice, um, it's easy for me to get, uh, fall out of devotion to the practice of it if I have an expectation that's gonna happen or if I feel let down that it when it doesn't, because it doesn't happen every time.
yeah.
There might be lots of times in a row where it doesn't, and you're just showing up and you're just, like, moving through the process, and it's work and nothing's sparking, but you're still there showing up. Um, yeah, I love it. I welcome it. I cherish it when that happens and that flow happens and I'm in the river. Um but I can't always predict when it's gonna happen, and I certainly can't expect that it will happen. Um otherwise I just lose the rhythm of showing up and sitting down and dipping in. So for me, just getting there and being ready, like walking halfway into the dark forest, to
Mm,
use your metaphor, like if I've shown up and I've gone into the woods, even if nobody met me there, like I've done mine for the day. That's been a helpful mindset to keep me consistent in creating, even in the ups and downs of inspiration.
yeah. I think it's somehow connected with chance, but I'm not sure exactly how to explain it. That
Maybe, yeah.
you have those two forces in the universe of gravity and chance. And I'm sure there's other things, but this is just what I'm going with on this motif. And it's is chance really chance, or is that just how it was supposed to happen? I don't know. Sounds like the
Yeah,
beginning of a poem somewhere. What's
definitely.
what's your experience with collaborative writing? I mean, in a music school, I would
Oh,
imagine there's a lot of
yeah.
that, but
So I am married to my favorite collaborator. I actually
Convenient.
yeah, it helps. Easy to schedule time on the calendar together. Um, Actually hard because we're both parents, so we have to be really intentional. But let's see. So writing music together. Let's start with music. I don't write a lot of music together with people. I actually do most of my writing alone. Although one of my favorite songs that I ever wrote, I was, hanging out with my husband. It was at the very beginning of our relationship. We were really young, and, I was just messing around on the piano, and I just asked him to, like, tell me just a random phrase, like, "Just say something random and I'll write you a song about it," and so he
Mm.
did, and I wrote a song, and we were, like, laughing because it was just such a ridiculous, silly song, and it was, like, so playful and dumb, and it wound up being such it's totally one of my favorites, and I wound up recording it, and it was great, and, yeah, it was just a lot of fun. So that type of joking, fun, playful collaboration, I love with music. Um, I've never been in a band before. I think that would be
Mm.
fun to write music in a band with people. I've never done that, but I have recorded. When I recorded my first album, I worked with some studio musicians, and my producer was actually an exceptionally good guitar player. And we had a lot of collaborative sessions where I would share the songs, the song concept, and he would bring his own. I can't play guitar. I've tried to learn it 6 times and failed every time. So he would bring his own ideas and his own absolutely his own spirit and flavor to the song with what he would bring on the guitar, and then we had other musicians join us, and one of my best friends was a drummer, and he came and played on the album, and so that was really collaborative, but we were arranging the music and producing it. We weren't writing it. So
Mm.
the writing process for me is still really private and usually just really focused. um, but writing books, I love to write books with my husband. He creative writing has been his is his passion and has been since I met him. And we've written a lot of things together. And that process, I I mean, that's like collaborative through and through for me. I have written some things by myself, but I haven't had as much fun as when I write them with him. And so, all the way from plotting the book through drafting it, editing it, all of it is sort of a conversation between us and like this really
Okay.
fun sort of collaborative process. It's a blast. So I love collaborating in that medium.
It's like pitching ideas back and forth all the time and
Oh
then
yeah, yeah.
recording them. Yeah.
Yeah, we
What?
actually played with we've always been really, really open and shared every detail. I mean, I will know his characters almost as well as he will know them as he's writing the book because I've heard so much and we've talked through so many scenes together. But this last book that he was working on, I told him, don't tell me anything because I want to read it as a reader. I want to be a fresh slate for you. And I want to be able to give you a reader's opinion when I edit it for you. I don't want to know your intent because when I know what he's trying to do with a scene or I know what the arc is of the character, I already know the ending, like it can't hit me fresh because I already see his intention in the text and it changes how I receive it. And that was the hardest thing to not like he was working on this book for like 2 years and I didn't ask and he didn't tell me and it was so hard to not know anything about it. But then when I got to read the manuscript finally, it was awesome. It was so much fun. To finally to and to just get to experience it fresh like a reader would was a trip and it was great. And you should have seen him. He was like peeking around the corner, like sitting, like waiting
Really?
to hear. He was so eager to hear my response because he'd had it all bottled up for 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's fun.
Have you been in writing groups before, or is it
Yeah.
just mainly,
Yeah.
what's your experience with those?
Let's see. So we lived in London for a little bit while he was in grad school and he was studying writing there. And we had a little group, a little writers group there called No Pens Allowed. Because we had this rule as the writers group that you weren't allowed to write down anything. Like you weren't allowed to be taking notes and blah, blah, blah during the discussion. You just had to listen. And so the person whose work we were looking at that week or at that moment, they weren't allowed to speak and they weren't allowed to write. They just had to listen as everyone else in the writing group had a discussion and shared their reflections and their opinions. And responses to the work that had been shared. And it was wonderful. It was a blast. I feel like that was one of the most fun groups of people. And we were only together for like a year before the program ended and we all went different ways. But it was a fun way to share. It was a fun way to share work in a kind of safe space with this group of people who were kind of, in the arena, to use Brene
Mhm.
Brown's term. And also just to
I
hear
think
what
of
other
more
people's
Roosevelt,
processes were like. Oh, yeah. Roosevelt.
the
Sorry,
man in the
Roosevelt.
arena, the
That's
meaning
right.
being a
Via
person.
Brene Brown is where I first probably heard Roosevelt's metaphor there. But yeah, yeah. I'm not in a writing group now. I haven't been in a group for a long time, but that was rewarding.
That's interesting. I haven't heard a writing group like that before. I've been in a few, one called Shut Up and Write, which is you get there and then you just write while you're with people that are also writing. It was in a coffee
Hmm,
shop type place. And then you could talk after, but you don't talk for that hour while you're supposed to be writing. So it's setting that time aside for writing.
cool.
That was good. And then another one where it was, I don't know, I guess you could call it a critique group where you would bring in a selection and there was supposed to be a limit of like 2,000 words. That's a lot of words.
Hmm.
I tried to keep it to like 200 or less because I used it more of the idea of I'm trying something new and I want to see if people
Hmm.
understand it how I understand it. And
Hmm.
that turned more into a little bit of it got a little, people would bring in stuff that's 5,000 pages or 5,000 words, or they would just keep reading until someone stopped them. And you're like, okay, that's not the point of this group. It's more of the forced audience rather than
Yeah.
trying to get some feedback. So that's I don't like to see that happen, but I
Yeah.
haven't been to one like you were describing. That's interesting. As
It was
long as
nice
it's not
because
too
oh,
long.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no. We had there were limits on, and I think there were only maybe 8 of us, and not everybody came each time, and so it was a
Mm,
pretty small group. But yeah, what we found was it's so easy when you're the writer whose work is being passed around, when you hear the responses from people in the group, it's so easy to want to defend your work. Like, well, let me just explain where that came from. Or like, well, you may not have understood this, but we just found that people got, at worst defensive, at best wasted time talking about stuff like, they weren't receiving, just simply receiving the input from the group. And so when we
mm,
made that rule that you can't speak, it was kind of nice because it sort of forces you to be in listen mode. And the people in our group weren't too ruthless. They were usually, they provide positive feedback and some constructive criticism, usually just responses like, as I was reading through, I really love this part, I was riveted right here I was really confused, I had no idea, my mind was wandering, maybe there's some clarity that could be boosted there, whatever. And so we also had a good mix of people with good, you know who were able to articulate what their experience was while they were reading it.
mm.
um, and then the no pens part was interesting because it was another thing we found pulled people away from genuinely listening to each other. Like as they were receiving input, if they were taking really detailed notes and writing, then as they're writing, they're not hearing the next thing that is being said to them.
Yeah.
And the truth is, like, how often are you going to go back and read through all of your notes from the last 52 writing? Like, you're not going to go look at them anyway. The things that are going to stick are the things that are deep soaking and really resonate with you. And so, if you're listening with your whole mind, then those things are going to embed and you're going to remember them. So, yeah, we loved it. It was a great format for us.
Yeah, I like that. When you write words, what are your writing utensils for that? Like, are you using a computer? Are you typing it? What's your way?
When I use a computer, I can't stay out of edit mode. It's too easy to go back and wordsmith things and refine things, and I get in this edit loop where I've tried to write books on my computer before, and I never get past chapter 3. My husband and I joke about my chapter 3 curse because when I'm writing by myself, I never get past chapter 3 because I'm always going back and editing and trying to perfect and polish chapter 1 and 2, and then I abandon the book because it's going too slowly, and I've spent 6 months on 3 chapters. The number of times that has happened to me is truly embarrassing. So I cannot draft if I'm just creating and generating a first draft. I can't do it on a computer, or I get into edit too quickly.
Mm.
Um, so usually I'll start with a free write where I'm just pen and paper, writing as I'm thinking, totally stream of consciousness to sort of think through maybe the outline or the form or the purpose or the structure of what I'm going to create. Um, and then usually I'll do a little bit of an outline or some sort of structural planning to where if it's a long form piece, um, prose, I'll usually have some mile markers that I outline by hand before I try to go write it with a computer. The only book I've ever finished, which I just wrote totally by myself, did not collaborate on this one. I actually spoke it because I could not break out of this like compunction to go edit it, and so I actually just dictated um, chapter by chapter. I kind of knew like what I wanted to talk about and what I was trying to get across, um, and then I would go walk and I would just record it into the voice notes app on my phone. Um, and then in the process of taking that dictation and transcribing it into written word and then, being able to edit on my computer, then I'm in front of Word doc on my laptop. And so my edit brain is happy, and it was really easy to go back and, well, not easy. It was actually really time intensive, but um, it put good barriers around whether or not I could edit and rework during the drafting process, because it's impossible to do as you're speaking it out. So that was an interesting approach. I don't know if I will write another book that way, but it worked, and I actually finished the book and was able to draft it fully and edit it and complete it. So it was effective, at least.
I feel like you definitely need to have a mini tape recorder when you do that. So when you're out in public talking to someone, you can go, hold on, wait a second. Let me just,
Yes, that would be awesome. That would up my cool factor by like 100 points at least.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you could tell if it was a successful session by how many times you had to stop the conversation to talk a little bit.
That'd be great.
Or
Yeah.
you just say, okay, walk with me for a moment, but don't say anything. All right. We're in a field.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Hmm.
I have to give that a
Was
try.
the title of that book, "This is the only book I've ever finished"? What
Should
was the
be. Yeah,
title?
probably. That'll be. No, it actually I haven't found the right title yet. I just finished it a couple months ago, and it's a nonfiction book. It's actually about uh, navigating the creative process and balancing creative freedom and financial stability and how to do that, and it sort of is intended to walk someone through the process of um, setting themselves up for greater creative fulfillment. And so I
Hmm.
haven't found the right title yet. I'm hoping it comes to me.
I think it's gonna have to be mixed in with some sort of tonal thing. So, I don't know if
Yes.
the onomatopoeia will be appear, but
Hopefully
maybe some.
alliteration. I can never get too much alliteration
Oh,
and rhyming. I just need it to be super cheesy. No, nothing on my brainstorm list works just
hmm.
yet, but it'll
And then
emerge at some
maybe
point.
maybe the next book could be called Chapter 4 or Start at Chapter 4.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yep.
that's a good idea. Yep.
Hmm. All right. So publishing and marketing, how do you deal with that?
That's a great question, and that's an entirely new frontier for us. So boy, what a question. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with it logistically and tactically? Like, how do you go about navigating that world, or how do you deal with it emotionally and keep your creativity alive
Hmm,
and well during that
that's
process?
interesting. Let's go with the technical side.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you I have the keys to the kingdom on publishing yet because it's a very long process to traditionally publish a book. We've almost decided to self-publish, but haven't chosen to go with that path just yet. And so I haven't actually gotten a book through the traditional publishing process yet, but I'm still working on it. So maybe in a couple years I'll have more to share there. But at this point, we're in the process of finding the right partnerships and querying literary agents. We've worked with some editors that we've hired ourselves independently to work through our manuscripts. And so I have a lot of tips there about good ways to partner with an editor in a constructive way and how to do that independently. But yeah, I think at this point, the traditional publishing world is um, probably a world where the most persistent people win. um, and so we're just trying to be persistent. We'll see if that works.
What's the negative of self-publishing to you then?
I think self-publishing is an excellent vehicle for someone who has an existing platform and has connection to an audience to whom they can promote their book. Um, I don't think there's any downside if you're not concerned about volume of sales. So I think the average self-published book sells about 50 to 70 copies. If you're in triple digits, then that's, I think, a pretty huge success in terms of the bell curve of sales that self-published books see. Um, and so in some cases, when the desire is to have a book that you can reference, that you can share with people with whom you're already connected, I think self-publishing can be a great way to do that. And so the nonfiction book I was talking about, I'm actually planning to self-publish because it will, as a self-published book, be the tool that I need it to be. So I'll be able to use it in my conversations with people. I'll be able to use it to help teach and guide people in who I'm already connected with or who are already in my world on some level. However, I think traditional publishing is much better at leveraging the frameworks in the industry to scale you beyond your current reach. So if you don't have an existing platform, if you don't have a large circle of readers and you're wanting to break into higher levels of sales, or you're wanting to hit more of the mainstream, platforms and stores and bookshelves, I think traditional publishing is still the better path to do so. Um, there are obviously some outlier cases of self-published books that have done extraordinarily well and still hit mainstream audiences. But I think for the most part, it has to be a decision around what success means for your book and for you and how you're wanting to reach people. And I think it's important that authors be really honest with themselves about what they have at their disposal and how they can reach readers, and whether or not they can do that independently or whether it's going to be helpful for them to partner with people in the industry who have broader networks and distribution pathways. So it's probably a pretty deeply personal equation for the author. For us at this point, the fiction that we've written, we think it'd be fun to see it kind of get legs in the traditional publishing world and reach audiences we couldn't reach ourselves at this point. But we'll see. I don't know. My thoughts on that topic evolve by the year. So we'll see in a few
Here's,
years how it all unfolds.
here's something to consider from someone who's made tens of dollars in the self-publishing realm. Probably mostly from me and my mom buying them. But I think that book that you have that you're waiting to find a traditional publisher for, I think a lot of luck happens with publishing.
Yeah.
And time and place, knowing the right people, and it can do well. I would think that's the same for any type of art,
Mm-hmm.
writing, poetry, painting, music, any of that. It's that opportunity. How do you get the opportunity? But think of how many people your book reaches if you self-publish it versus how many people your book reaches if you hold on to it for
Yeah,
years trying to find a publisher. That even if you
true.
found a publisher, like if Penguin or Random House or whatever the big publishers are now say, hey, we'd like to publish your book that's you've already self-published, you can still do that. But
Mm-hmm.
think of the people that may have gotten connected with it otherwise. Maybe even
It's
if there's
true.
only 10 people that buy it, you put it on Amazon, you go through KDP, you put it in audiobook and soft cover and Kindle, and 10 people read it. What are those 10 people going to do? How's it going to affect them? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that they're waiting, that the world is waiting on for them to be able to spark something in them to do something else. So you never know what the reach of it is. And you
It's
can
true.
always
A ripple
switch it
effect.
over. Yeah, you can always switch it over to the traditional
Mhm.
publishing. From what I hear from regular publishers now is more of, they won't take you if you're an unknown unless you already have a following. So
Yeah.
there's that to consider. And maybe it's the other way too, that somebody, you get a literary agent, they just happen to have enough time to read it and it's that great, and they pass it along to someone else and they think it's that great, and then it works out, which is great. But that can also happen while you've self-published it, and you can have
Yeah.
a copy of that on your shelf. So when the EMP hits and all the computers are destroyed, you'll still have that soft cover of your book.
You'll still have it there on your shelf.
Yep.
Evidence, evidence. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think for me, I don't wanna be Emily Dickinson with the shoebox of poems under my bed and nobody read
What a
them,
great poet, though. What a great
right?
poet.
See what a wonderful collection she
Dwell in
had.
possibilities. Yes.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, you're right, and that's an excellent point. And I think for for me, and us, this is the book, the books we've written together, my husband and I think our sanity saver has just been drawing a line in the sand and say, okay, we're going to query 50 literary agents, or we're going to query 100, or like picking what that number is and saying we're going to be consistent and persistent through that list. And if none of those people are a match and it's not a fit for their agencies, then great. Okay, we'll go self publish it. And like you said, it can still bring a lot of value to people, and we can still um, have it out in the world and have it out in the daylight, and not being hoarded away, waiting for some level of recognition it may not receive, right? Yeah, I think no matter which path you take, the path to having it out there is always longer than you think it's going to be.
Mm.
Or at least it has been in my case. Like when I set out making things, I thought it would be, X months or years before I had hit whatever goalpost it was, that I was setting, like in writing, publishing, or in music, having an album out there, or, painting, selling a collection or whatever. And that goalpost has always been so much further away than I initially realized or thought that it was. Um, and so my real interest and passion has been around, how do you keep your creative spirit fulfilled and sustained and flourishing throughout that long process to publication or whatever it is, so that your creative well-being can remain high even before you've hit that place where you feel like you've arrived and have some sort of um, title or metric that tells you that you've succeeded at what you set out to do.
So do you think for your personal writing, the writing you've done, do you think the measure of success is how many copies you sell?
Not right now. Right now, the measure of success has to be, am I enjoying writing it? Is it bringing value to people who are reading it, who I'm sharing it with right now? Um, am I capturing what I want to capture? Am I saying what I want to say? Right now, that's the success. And then someday, what if it's published? Depending on the venue in which it's published. If I've self-published my book, I'll probably set some sort of milestone or benchmark, that might be a lot lower than if I'm traditionally published, where I'm trying to gauge that success and define that success based on the context of the work and how it's being released and how it's being promoted and distributed. So someday, to understand whether a sales campaign, a marketing campaign was effective, like you have to have some benchmark around sales. And I think that's important for any creative business, whether you're a writer or a painter or a musician, having some concept of what tangible metric you're aiming for. Um, Number of downloads, number of listens. Is it your reach? Is it your followership? Is it money in the door, which is really different from reach and followership? It's important to have a number you can point at and objectively say, yes, I'm making progress, or no, I'm not going that direction. But I think the important thing is to have, alongside that really tangible objective metric, to have another metric around the experience, around your relationship with your creativity, the creative health that you're feeling, that's a totally separate yardstick. And I think it's just as important, if not more important, in my opinion.
What do you think Melville would say about success?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like you know what Melville would say about success.
I don't know a lot about Melville, but I've read Moby Dick, and I it took me a long time to read, and I know that he died without a lot of money, and he dedicated the book to Hawthorne for whatever type of relationship they had. Who knows? But
Mhm.
then after, like, he wrote it the first time, and Hawthorne said, is it Hawthorne or Thoreau? I might be getting those mixed up. I think it's Hawthorne. And he said, you could write better than this, because it was just the story. It didn't have like the instruction manual part, the firsthand knowledge of whaling, because that's what Moby Dick is. It's a whaling instruction book, and it's also a story.
Mhm.
And then Melville went back and rewrote it with all of those things involved, dedicated it to Hawthorne, and then Hawthorne never talked to him again after that. So
Wow.
the story goes. And Melville died without a lot of money, without a lot
Mm.
of success. And then 100 years later, it's known as the Great American Novel.
Yeah.
So that success might not be reached. I just wonder, in your lifetime, I wonder what Thoreau would say about success. Like, would he look at that and say it was a great writing? I'm glad I wrote it. I'm glad I sacrificed all this. I had a good time writing it. Or would it be more of a story of, I wish I'd never written it, because this guy would still be my friend, and I could have
Yeah.
been a clerk somewhere and made more money. I don't, I guess that's how you measure success. But when I read Moby Dick, it, it takes me a long time, but there are things in it, and the tone of it, the meter and flow of the writing, where if you're just reading it for the words and not trying to understand everything, where it's closer to the flow of Shakespeare. But when you study it chapter by chapter and try to figure out what all those words mean that you don't know, what all those references are, that may have only been a reference of the time, whether it's to the King of England or a dig at the King of England or whatever, then you go back and read it and you feel the poetry or the lyricism of it. And it's not, for me, it's not in every chapter, but it's in
Mhm.
enough of it to where I go, wow, I can see why it's the great American novel, why it has all these things, that it's not a Stephen King book. And you
Mhm.
can't argue with Stephen King's success. But what success would you rather have, the Stephen King commercial success or the Melville timelessness? I mean, I don't, 100 years from now, will people be reading Stephen King like they're reading Melville? Will they even be reading Melville? I don't know. Time will
Yeah.
tell, but
I'd
I
wager
don't know.
that answer has to be so personal. Has to be so personal. I think building clarity around that, around what does creative success mean to me, in the like swim in the deep end, like what does it really mean to you? I think you have to have the answer there, because there are forks in the road, there are low days, there are moments where you get a little upside down in why you keep doing this thing. And you have to be able to anchor back in to why you keep doing this thing and why it's important to you. Um, my advice for my clients is always to ground that success in something within their control, something that they can truly, like if you say success, creative success for me is going to be that sell out, I make this great advance and I sell out my book and blah, 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 whatever. I make the best time, New York Times bestseller list. And those are all really wonderful goals. But to your point, um, Melville wouldn't have attained any of those. He couldn't have claimed any of those success markers, and yet here you are, this many years later, just in total awe and reverence of the thing that he created. And it's changed you and it's brought you this magic. And that's a big deal. So I think I would even ask one question more like, what does your success matter? Like whether or not Melville believed himself to be successful really has no bearing on anybody. It's kind of up to him. Like when he experienced his life as an artist, did he feel fulfilled in that? Um, I sure hope so. I would like to think he did, but I don't know. He may have felt like a terrible failure. Um, I think it's up to each of us individually to decide where we're going to find success, how we're going to measure success. For me, it comes down to the relationship I have with my creativity and whether I feel like that relationship is fruitful and rewarding, and enjoyable. And that's totally within my control. And if I had an external accolade, some sales figure or some number of downloads or whatever it is, that might fan the flames and make me feel like I was having a day in the sun. But at the end of the day, it's really for me about the relationship with creativity and whether that is or isn't being um, lived to the fullest and embraced and supported and enjoyed.
Hmm. Well said. I wonder how much success changes writers. Like, what would highly successful writers be like, or artists in general? What would they be like if they didn't attain that? And I think that's one of those things that it's the unknowable. You can't know all the paths at once.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They'd
Maybe,
probably be just like one of the other writers in the writing group, right? Someone passionate about their work who loves what they've come up with and have a small circle of people who see it. And, um, you know, I would imagine if J.K. Rowling hadn't experienced the success she experienced, she'd probably be like one of our friends at the writing group sharing this quirky little wizard story. And, like I think there's a lot of similarity across people who share a passion for a given craft. So, um, yeah, that's an interesting question.
I think that's one of the things I like the best about creativity is you can recognize it in other people. And if you talk to a poet and you're a poet, you can see that. And if you talk to a musician, two musicians talking are going to be on a different level than people that aren't a musician talking to someone that's not.
Mhm.
That's interesting to me. That's the reason for the podcast, really, is to talk to creative people.
Just
With
talking shop.
with your bio, maybe we can end with these ideas where you talk about unblocking creativity, which I think we've talked about, and then intentional patterning. Intentional
Yeah.
patterning. Well, patterning. There you go. Okay, said it right the third time. What I think you talked a little bit about that, but what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be learned from our own patterns and how we engage with our creativity, how we engage within the creative process. Um, so when I talk about intentional patterning, I mean two things, two patterns I care about. One pattern is how do you show up in your creative practice? What rhythms do you have when you create? How consistent are you in upholding those rhythms? Do you have clarity around when and where and how and why you're making what you're making? And how can you learn from the patterns that you might observe in yourself now? And how can you be more intentional in shifting those towards patterns that are going to help you move steadily toward the outcome that you're looking for? The other patterns I'm interested in are the patterns of thought and patterns of behavior that underpin the external patterns. So, like if we're talking about a writing routine and you say, yeah, I really like to write. I wish I wrote 5 days a week. My pattern right now is I write about 3 times a month, but I really wish I wrote 5 times a week. We are only going to get so far if we stay at the surface level of talking about, and there's important stuff to be had at the surface level around, like, do you have the time and space that you need? Do you have the dedicated focus that you need? Can you get into the right mindset? What types of things can help you get into the right mindset? What types of creative rituals can get you there? How can you incentivize? Like, there's a lot to be had at the surface level. But where you really get into the good stuff and where you really find change is when you dig deeper than that into the patterns of thought and belief. And um, when you think about going to write, how do you respond to that? What cognitive pathways fire? What are the automatic thoughts that trigger as soon as you start to think about whether you're going to go sit down at your manuscript or not? During a writing session, when it's going well, how are you thinking about it? How are you thinking about yourself as a writer? When it's going terribly, how are you thinking about yourself as a writer? What are the patterns of self-talk that come into play and direct how you move forward in a session when it's going horribly? When you're done with a session, what are your patterns of thought? When you're sharing your work, what are your patterns of thought? When you're promoting your work, when you're receiving feedback, when you're receiving criticism, when you're talking about yourself in the creative world with other people and you're embracing your identity as a writer or not, what are the patterns of cognitive, emotional, spiritual belief and action and identity that are fueling you in those moments and are defining how you're showing up? So, when I talk about intentional patterning, what I mean is recognizing the patterns that are there and then being really mindful and purposeful about training in the patterns that are really going to support us the best and allow us to achieve the fulfillment that we really want in our creative practice. Super fun work, also super deep digging work, and requires people to really look in the mirror and dig in with themselves. But it's if they're willing to go there and do that, it almost always transforms the way they're showing up in their creative practice.
I like that. What's the best way for people to follow your work then?
Yeah. I actually have put together, well, if you want to see what's happening in my studio now and what I'm working on, you can always see me on Instagram. I'm at Lauren Spangler. And if you're interested in how your relationship with creativity is doing and sort of whether you are or aren't well positioned to be fulfilled and aligned in your creative undertakings, I've put together a quick 10-minute survey, or not survey, self-assessment that people can take that I think helps them gauge whether they have some places in their creative life that they might be able to fine tune to increase their fulfillment and their sense of agency within their creative life. So I call it my spark or sputter assessment, and that's totally free. Don't even need an email to download it. It's truly just a free gift. Hope it helps. And that can be found at laurenspangler.com/spark. So that's one way people get involved in my world and start to see the type of work that I do. So that's a great place to start.
All right. In the show notes, I'll have those links for your Instagram and for your website. So if people want to go directly to it, they'll be able to.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any thoughts or ideas in closing?
Man, this has been a far-reaching and deep-diving conversation. I have really enjoyed it. It's given me a lot to think about around some of the big questions, which is what I love to connect with people about. So thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciated the conversation with you, and hope this helps people.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. And again, your links will be in the show notes. So I'll talk to you on the end or on the other side of this this musical exit.
Thanks.
Thanks again. Yep. Thank you.